Okay, I'm RC. Welcome back. We've been spending this week really building into a conversation on success. And there were some things that we've done very intentionally. We started by looking at how you view success. And I wanted you to see a couple things about how you view it, right? The first was I wanted you to see that we all have a view of it. We all have an idea of what success looks like. We know in our minds what a successful person is or what they look like from our own perspectives. I also wanted you to understand that how you view success is really important because it is setting the direction that your life is taking, because we all want to be that success, which means we're kind of moving towards that idea as a goal. So with all of that, when we put that all together and we really think about it, that means that we really need to understand what success is and what it's not. Then yesterday, we added to that discussion by really looking at just a few places in Scripture that talk about success. And I wanted you to start to see that a successful life has to be deeper than just the wealth and the fame and the power that so many would associate with it. This is why we continue to come back to this big question. What is success to you? What does it look like? And my hope is that as we start to look at a biblical view of success, it started or could continue to shape maybe your idea and your own personal view and image of what a successful life is. And today we're going to keep this conversation going by looking at a guy in Scripture that is the most successful man that ever lived. But more than just how successful he was, I wanted you to see kind of what he does at the end of his life, now looking back, the conclusion that he makes about all his successes. So today we're going to be looking at Solomon. He's the wisest. He's the most successful king the world has ever seen. And I love reading about Solomon because we know that this guy asked for wisdom so that he could lead his people well, and that God was so impressed by that he actually gives them that discernment to lead the people well, that wisdom, and also gives them everything else that any other human would ask for in the first place, which was the power, the fame, the fortune, the wealth, all of it. So you could say that Solomon understands what it looks like to have the most, to be the most accomplished, since, he's the greatest king that's ever lived. Name the game and Solomon wins. But there are some things about him that I think are important for us to understand. And I think they'll build into this idea and where we're heading with this success discussion in general. And I think it's going to help as we build into this idea of our own view of a successful life. I want you to see some things about this guy Solomon. Number one, and I think this is important for us to look at, is he was set up really well to succeed by his father, King David. He was given much by David. You could say he is a privileged person. He's been given so much, and he's really riding out the promises that God made to his daddy throughout this whole process. So I want you to see some things here. In 1 Kings 2, we can start to really see this. When the time drew near for David to die, he gave a charge to Solomon, his son. I'm about to go the way of the earth, he said, so be strong, show yourself a man, and observe what the Lord your God requires. Walk in his ways, and keep his decrees and commands, his laws and requirements, as written in the law of Moses, so that you may prosper in all you do and wherever you go, and that the Lord may keep his promise to me. If your descendants watch how they live, and if they walk faithfully before me with all their heart and soul, you will never fail to have a man on the throne of Israel. That's the promise God made to David, not to Solomon. 1 Chronicles 29, we see this. And give my son Solomon the wholehearted devotion to keep your commands, requirements and decrees, and to do everything to build the palatial structure for which I have provided. That's David praying and thinking through Solomon about to take over the throne. And 23, he says, so Solomon sat on the throne of the Lord as king in place of his father David. He prospered, and all of Israel obeyed him. All the officers and mighty men, as well as all of King David's sons, pledged their submission to King Solomon. Now check this out. The Lord highly exalted Solomon in the sight of all Israel and bestowed on him royal splendor such as no king over Israel ever had seen before. So, yeah, Solomon's set up well here. David has taken care of his son well here. He's now going to live under the promises that God has made Daddy David, right? So Solomon was dealt a good hand. I think we could all say that, where God gave him all the wisdom, but also all the wealth, all the success, all the fame, all the power. And I think that's important for us to see. I mean, we see it right in Scripture, more than any king had ever seen. So Solomon wins, right? He looks at all this and he kind of comes to these conclusions in his life. But it's important to see the conclusions that this wise man comes to as he grows old, like as he grows into his life. And to do that, we can look at the book of Ecclesiastes and see some amazing things that Solomon says about his life, looking back over it all. So he's going to get to the end and look back over all he's experienced. He's going to look at all the fame, the money, the castles, the success, the big screen TVs, the nice cars, the women, all of it. And he's going to come to a really interesting conclusion. And that conclusion is that all of it's meaningless. See, I know not everybody reads the book of Ecclesiastes and gets really fired up. Like in a lot of ways, it's not super inspiring to a lot of people to hear that all that their life's work become meaningless. But this is a book of the Bible that's really meant a lot to me, especially in some of the more challenging times of my life. And I want you to see that in this book, we see this wise king at the end of his life, looking back over all that was, and he's coming to some really powerful realizations. And I mean, look at the very first line of the book of Ecclesiastes, and he says this in Ecclesiastes 1, verses 1 and 2. These are the words of the teacher, King David's son, who ruled in Jerusalem. Everything is meaningless, says the teacher. Completely meaningless. Well, yikes, right? Like, what in the world? I mean, and I get it. When you read this, you can think, good grief, this is depressing, right? It's chapter after chapter in this book of Solomon's anguish as he begins to come to some really depressing conclusions about life. So it can be a little bit challenging to read, but I want you to understand how powerful this is. This is Solomon. He's the wisest. He's the most successful man who has ever walked the earth. And he's saying that in the end, nothing matters. So then he goes on to talk about how all of his work is meaningless, all of his wealth that he obtained is meaningless, all the pleasures that he's experienced, and there's been a lot of them, right? All the fame, like all of it's meaningless. And he walks us through so much that he's done and accomplished, and he keeps coming back to how empty it all is. And then every once in a while, he'll pop up and say something from time to time, like we'll see here in Ecclesiastes 3:14. I really like this in the Message version. He says, I've also concluded that whatever God does, that's the way it's going to be, always. No addition, no subtraction. God's done it, and that's it. That's so we'll quit asking questions and simply worship in holy fear. That's pretty powerful, isn't it? And I get it. Not too many people will read the book of Ecclesiastes and see the value of this book. And many can agree that the book of Ecclesiastes can almost feel discouraging. But I really want you to see the conclusion that Solomon comes to, which you can read at the end of the book of Ecclesiastes. So he's dropped all of these thoughts, and they're powerful, beautiful statements. And we see great songs written about some of these statements in the book of Ecclesiastes. And we get to the end of the book, and we see something that I think is such a big deal. After dropping all of these thoughts on life, this is what he says about what he's experienced in Ecclesiastes 12, verses 13 and 14. Now all has been heard. Here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil. So this is Solomon, the richest, the most powerful, the most famous. He had it all. He experienced it all. Remember, when it comes to anything, Solomon wins. But we see it again. In spite of his wisdom, power, and fame, and underneath all the perfect social media posts and things that he's done that we look at and say, wow. In spite of all the flashy wealth and the perceptions that everyone had of him, what we see here is just another imperfect sinner in need of God's love, in need of God's mercy, and in need of God's forgiveness at the end of his life. See, in the book of Ecclesiastes, Solomon talks of the mistakes that he made, right, over the course of his life. And he comments on his personal experiences and what he had also observed in the lives of others and also sought after as an image of success that maybe wasn't all that accurate. Solomon is giving us a gift here in his life. And as the person who had it all, he shares what he learned. And that was that in the end, there's nothing that's truly going to satisfy in life but to love God and to serve God. Solomon is looking over a life that looks beyond successful to any of our earthly eyes, by any of our measure of what success could be. And in the end, he's saying all those pursuits are meaningless. They're all empty. And now this old man, Solomon, is saying we would do better to spend our lives focused on God rather than pursuing earthly success. Do you see that? So before we close this out, I think there's something that we need to address about what we're talking about here. And it's something that was really in my mind as I was getting ready to close this section right there. And I think it needs to be talked about. So before we close this out, I want you to think of this. Are you hearing all that I just said about Solomon and his life and all that? And are you thinking to yourself like, oh, poor Solomon, right? Like, I mean, it must be nice to live out the life that guy lived out, right? Like, do you see the privilege that he was been given because he's David's son? He's David's kid, so he gets everything, right? Do you kind of roll your eyes and think, it must be nice to be that guy, right? Like, really, Sam? Why don't you give me the wealth, the fame, the power? Let me experience all those pleasures that he was given. Give me all that privilege. Give me the hand that guy was dealt. Let me come to my wise conclusions at the end of this time, right? Isn't that kind of what we do here when we see something like this? See, if you're thinking that way, I get it. And I'm not going to nice this up for you. Solomon was dealt a really nice hand. Like, I don't think Solomon was ever worried about paying his mortgage or going and paying for groceries at his local grocery store. Like, I know his house and his car and his TV were nicer than mine. Like, I get it. But I think this continues to build into the idea of what success is and leads us right into the core teaching that I want to bring up to you tomorrow from Jesus. And it's a subject that we're going to hit really hard tomorrow, and I really hope you're in it with me when we do it. Because you're right. We haven't all been dealt the same hand. You have skills and talents and strengths that I don't have, and vice versa. Some have more wealth. Some have more income, more talents, more privilege, and some have less. But what we're going to see tomorrow is Jesus letting us know that a successful life is more about who you are and what you do with what you're given than what all you've been given. So as we close this section of the talk down, I want to go back to our question of the week. What is success to you? What does it look like? See, we've been looking at this view of success and what it is, and I'm hoping that it's being shaped through these talks so far. We've looked at some Bible verses and what they have to say about success, and today we turned it and looked at the life of the most successful person that ever lived and what his conclusions were about all of it, where his life ended up. And it makes me wonder, is this shifting your view of success? What is success to you? I want you to keep thinking this all through. What does it look like? And tomorrow, we're going to talk about what Jesus says is a successful life in the life of a disciple of his. And until then, just keep pressing in on this question. Keep asking yourself. Think about it through the course of your day. What is success to you? What does it look like? We'll see you tomorrow.